we go. All right, we're live. So welcome to our weekly basic income discussion group. This week we are talking about Silicon Valley, and we read an article by Douglas Rushkoff. He's the guy who wrote Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus. And the title of the article is Universal Basic Income is Silicon Valley's Latest Scam. So from the title, I think you can kind of figure out how he feels about basic income and Silicon Valley. So I want to get a sense of, and my mom, Joan Houlihan, is on the live stream. That's exciting. So I want to start by going around the room and getting a sense of everyone's feelings about Silicon Valley and in general, and in what ways you think they're doing good or maybe doing harm, and then also how you feel about their connection to the basic income discussion.
Okay.
Yeah. So Bethany.
I generally have very positive feelings towards Silicon Valley.
Okay.
I think that I like the kind of optimistic, energetic spirit of optimism. Spirit of like trying to create new good things for the future. I like a lot of the innovations that have come out of it. I like the fact that it generally tends to lead people to be more philanthropic than you might see with really, really wealthy people in other domains. So like you have Bill Gates, you have Zuckerberg giving away like huge amounts of their money and trying to think carefully about how to do it effectively, which I at least don't know of as many visible examples and sort of a culture of that among other kind of areas and also historically in terms of wealth. So these are some of like the general associations that I have. I think it's kind of funny that people there often feel like they should start a startup before they have an idea, but it's also something like I feel fondly about, and I think it's an interesting aspect of the economy to have. In terms of basic income, I think it's interesting that I think it's cool that there are some people like trying to think about it seriously. I think it's part of the general sort of thinking out of being willing to think about things differently or think about how things could change. That Silicon Valley is generally sort of a niche for. They're not quite like my home the way that New England and academia is, but I have an appreciation.
Okay.
And I think that them taking basic income seriously somewhat is, all else being equal, like helpful.
Yeah.
I guess that's what I think.
Okay.
I clearly didn't write this article.
You didn't write this article. Yeah.
But I do agree with a few. Like I have a few things I'm sympathetic to, so I'll talk about that later.
Cool.
Yeah.
Nick.
Well, first of all, I didn't get a chance to read the article, but one of the things I am curious about is like what people really mean when they say Silicon Valley. I think, at least when I see this, I imagine that he means sort of Silicon Valley now, so like Google and Facebook. Mm-hmm. And what you were saying about
talks a lot about Uber, like just the big companies.
Yeah. The current sort of generation of it. But I think Silicon Valley, that what's happening there now has roots going back. There's like a few generations of cycles of innovation that has had huge impact. Like going back all the way to like Apple, and before that to whoever it was before that. Yeah, Xerox and Hewlett Packard. I don't know. And I guess so. I don't know. I think it's got good and bad, and I think it has a kind of amazing track record of producing stuff that is making huge impacts. And I think that just is.
Okay, cool. Jim.
I haven't read the article either. I look forward to it. I'm just invited to sit in on this. I worked for a company that had operations in Silicon Valley over quite a few years, and it was a company that invented equipment, and we really benefited from being able to be located there because there were lots of people, available looking for work that knew about the technology that we used, and they struggled with, finding places to live that were. We were there over a long enough period of time to really experience the change that came about as Silicon Valley became more and more desirable as a place to have a business and so forth. So people had to live further and further away. Since then, more recently, I have known a number of people who have worked for the one I'm thinking of in particular is Google, and they wound up riding the bus
Right.
from quite far away. So I think I experienced the good and the bad in a way. But I think I'm sensing from you the ethos or the spirit of creativity that we associate with Silicon Valley is real and a good thing. How that relates to the basic income question is one that we'll probably come to later.
All right. Richard.
Well, I run a Facebook page that the automated economy that deals with pretty much just about everything that comes out of Silicon Valley. So I'm obviously rather in favor of the whole system of that they have with startups and the innovation and things like that. My issue with Silicon Valley is that they don't really think of the impacts of what they do further down the line. They're not developing the whole, they do it after the fact with, we're just going to create this organization that studies the ethics for robotics or AI or whatever, but they don't do it beforehand. They don't think of the societal implications. They I don't really know what to say.
So what about basic income in Silicon Valley?
Well,
So it's okay. It's okay if you don't have anything right now. Yeah. So I mean, I think technology is great, and I think in the article he talks about, he starts off talking about how he was invited to go to Uber's headquarters, and then he, confronted them saying, that. I don't know. He feels that all the kind of the jobs that were destroyed in the taxi industry, that's a problem for our society, and it is a problem if we're expecting people to have those jobs and get their incomes from those jobs. And from his perspective, if you're destroying something that's really important to the fabric of our economy, then that's a problem. What I thought was interesting is that when he went in there, he said he was complaining about all this stuff, how Silicon Valley was disrupting the economy, and specifically how Uber was disrupting the economy, and then someone from the Uber audience, one of the Uber employees, said, "Well, what about basic income?" And the way he tells the story here, he says, "Wait a minute, I thought that's my line." Like he was pro basic income, but and this is what he says: "Up until that moment, I had been an ardent supporter of universal basic income, that is, government cash." Payments to people whose employment would no longer be required in the digital economy. So the implication is that as soon as he found out that people he didn't like were also for basic income, he kind of switched sides and became against basic income. And I think that's interesting because I agree with what Richard said, that a lot of times you're working on a technology and you don't know how that technology is going to affect the world. That doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't be developing that technology, but it's and I don't know that there is a way to kind of like anticipate all the effects of it. Like if you're a startup, you're just trying to survive till the next day until suddenly you've got something successful, and then by then, if you're disrupting something in some way that's maybe causing something to get harder for someone, you're almost by definition reacting after the fact. Like there's not really it's not like a planned thing. Like it isn't just that they're not planning for the negative implications of what could possibly come for their startup. It's that it's hard to plan anything. Like they might have a vision for what they're doing, but they know that they can kind of go in any direction, and they often change their business and stuff like that. So it's much more of an organic thing, I think, and that I think is okay. And I think it's okay to say like, oh, hey, these trends are emerging or these things are changing. How are we going to respond to that? And I feel like basic income is a perfectly reasonable thing to suggest. I mean, most of us are for basic income here, but if I'm worried that Uber is harming society in some way, and then they suggest basic income as a possible solution, I mean that sounds good to me. That's not going to turn me off to basic income. It's going to be like I'm going to think, okay, they have some awareness about maybe some of our expectations of the economy, like taxi drivers having jobs and stuff like that, are not going to be valid in the future, and maybe they're a part of making that happen. So they're seeing it before maybe random people in the Midwest see it, because they're kind of part of that. Yeah.
Do you want to read some of what your mom added?
Yeah. So my mom says, I have mostly positive feelings about the innovation, etc., like Bethany, but it reminds me a little of Los Alamos and all the drive toward creating without considering implications for society. So Los Alamos, they developed, nuclear bombs. So that's, scientists being really excited about what they're doing. And in this case, they're literally creating like a physically destructive technology.
There's also a short-term, long-term thing with Los Alamos, right? Because like we were in the middle of a war, and lives were saved in the short term, but like nuclear holocaust was risky in the long term.
We weren't in the middle of a war for all of it, though, were we?
Oh, were we?
Not all of it.
Oh, okay.
Oh, all of it? Oh, okay. Yeah. All right.
And also other countries were racing to get the bomb too. So like the context of like whether they should have been doing that, even in a moral sense.
Like
kind of
J. Robert Oppenheimer said, I have become the god of destruction, the destroyer of worlds. Right. He was quoting the Bhagavad Gita or something like that.
Bhagavad Gita.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, just to point out that there was moral ambiguity. It wasn't just like they weren't considering it and it was obviously bad.
So maybe they had, more awareness of what they were doing. Yeah. And they had a very, very kind of specific plan. They weren't, like pivoting all over the place and, startups randomly, maybe it was more structured and more directed than Silicon Valley is.
Einstein wrote a letter to Roosevelt about how the bomb could destroy a harbor, but it turned out it was much more powerful than that.
Right. Anyway, I mean, I think it's a generally good point. I mean, I think one thing that came up for me is whether it's efficient or appropriate for companies to be the ones responsible for handling, especially when basically their main. So two things: what companies should be responsible for, but also if your main crime is improving things, in particular, should you be responsible for that? I mean, don't we want to incentivize companies to improve things in terms of technology? And if there's like these secondary issues, that doesn't seem like it's what companies are ideally designed to do.
Right, and kind of a related question to that is, if we're living in a world where people happen to be surviving because there's some inefficiency in the system that doesn't have to be there, does that mean we should be protecting that inefficiency, or do we find another way to?
In general, this sort of upset me about the article, which is that like it seemed like he was focusing on costs without any of the benefits. Like he talks about getting rid of the taxi service, but in my people chose to use Ubers instead of the taxis for a reason. Maybe it's sort of a small improvement, but it's like a pretty marked improvement in the service for the consumer, and I feel like he just kind of completely ignores that kind of benefit throughout most of the article. That technology is actually improving people's lives never comes up in this article.
Right.
He talks about it just as extractive, like they're just trying to make as much money as possible at everyone's expense, when really like they're only making the money for the most part, I would argue, because like people want to use what they're creating.
Right. Yeah, and I don't think they think of themselves as necessarily doing this harmful thing. They're making this profit, and people have to have money, and of course, something like a basic income can allow them to keep doing that. But if the people who are getting the basic income are spending their money buying services and goods that make their lives better, and they're able to keep doing that, then is that really a bad thing? That Uber is profiting by making people's lives better.
Right. He also, I totally agree. And one more thing I'll just point out that also bothered me is like he glosses over and poo-poos ending poverty like pretty, what's the word I'm looking for? Pretty not tritely, but like without much ceremony. So let me try to find where he says.
Is it this one? To the rescue comes UBI. The policy was once thought of as a way of taking extreme poverty off the table. In this new incarnation, however, it merely serves as a way to keep the wealthiest people and their loyal vassals, the software developers, at the very top of the economic operating system.
Right, but it doesn't merely serve to do that, right? So that's kind of my point. Is like it also ends poverty, and I feel like he's glossing over that pretty quickly.
Right. As it turns out, a side effect of ending poverty is that people have more money to spend,
right.
And then there's more profit to be made if you're a corporation.
Right.
That's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, and this does also bring up, like, I think he does have a point that if you're worried about inequality, like, the more money people have to spend, in some ways it could feed into inequality. So I was sympathetic to that. But at the same time, I felt like he shouldn't just fail to mention or fail to really emphasize the primary benefits of, the technological advances and ending poverty.
Yeah, and I think it's true that basic income doesn't address inequality. It doesn't fix that. That's not what it does. It provides money to consumers.
Right.
Which is an important problem, but there are other problems in the world.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Do you guys have any thoughts on these quotes? I know you didn't get to read the article, but any thoughts on what we've been talking about so far?
Yeah, I mean, some of the things you guys were saying were the things that were coming to my mind. Like Uber is displacing taxis because it's way better for the people who use it.
Yeah, exactly.
Like if you have a smartphone,
right?
I mean, I find it muess better.
Yeah.
Like as the consumer, it's better, and like you're saying, like that's why it's successful.
Right.
I guess I'm trying to remember where I was reading, but I think it's like not a kind of uncommon story to tell about, like, I don't know where we've come in the last 100 years or something, but this transition to maybe it was in that I don't remember, but the people used to really have their identity more from like their job or what function they carried out in the community, but now it's shifting more and more. It has shifted more and more toward like you are what you buy, right? Like consumption and I was skimming and I saw that he also gives the example of like big box retailers coming in and displacing the downtown shopping districts. That's another example of, you could say, well, that's another example of the preferences of people as consumers kind of determining the outcome.
Right.
And there are side effects of that are that we seen as negative.
Right.
That I see as negative. But at the same time, that's the choice we're all making. I mean, I don't see that as something imposed by the concentrations of capital who are running the show. I think that's kind of flows from people's freely made choices and preferences.
I agree.
And I think that, and I think this, I don't know, the view that I feel like I've learned from Alex and you guys in these discussions the last few meetings, thinking of UBI as just like enabling people to participate in that, enabling, like putting money in people's pockets so they can spend it, like so they can be consumers. makes it. I mean, when I think about it that way, it seems like a very logical next step in this evolution towards. It's really about buying stuff.
Right. And your time, I guess, too. Not having to necessarily work if it's not needed, that kind of thing. Time and money can be spent in a different way.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Depending on whether you think it would like eliminate some jobs that aren't needed, and then
Right.
you would have people have more time as well.
So
Yeah.
I think Nick, you hit on an important point, which is we care about people, but should we be thinking of people as workers or should we be thinking of them as consumers?
Right.
And some might argue, well, everybody's a worker and everybody's a consumer, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. It certainly has to be the case that everybody's a consumer because everybody needs to eat. Everybody has certain things that they're going to buy in the economy if they have money. So it makes sense to think of people as consumers, but we don't necessarily need labor from everyone. At least not in the conventional sense of having a job and participating in the labor market. So I think it makes a lot more sense to focus on the well-being of consumers rather than the well-being of the workers, even though there's some considerable overlap there. And I think a lot of some of these political ideologies really focus on kind of the labor side of things, focusing on people as workers, like the workers are an entire class of the common people. These are the workers, and we hold their labor up as this kind of like really valuable thing. Like we frame it as the economy is built on everybody's labor, and that's what makes everything possible, and kind of labor is
The end all be all.
the end all be all. Yeah, and I think this is people have this kind of like ingrained moral intuition about the value of labor and identity as workers. Like I think that's still around, even though it's shifting a little bit. And by the same token, I think there's this idea that consumerism is bad, that it's wasteful, and people are buying too much stuff, and thinking of people as consumers is feels somewhat distasteful.
Right,
to
which
some
actually
people.
gives you like a vision of like almost the opposite economy that you want, where everyone's like working a lot and not actually enjoying any very much of the products
working
of it,
and not
like
buying anything.
not consuming but working a lot.
Right,
Like,
right.
What? No. Yeah, and that's not to like sidestep environmental concerns and stuff that I think are legitimate, but but not everything you consume is bad for the environment. If you include like services and
right. Not all consumption is equally wasteful of resources. In economics, consumption just means using something of value and increasing your own utility through something that was produced for you or something like that.
your mom agrees that workers are righteous. If you don't work, you're a bum.
Workers are righteous. If you don't work,
I think
you're
she
a bum.
means that's the general
Yeah. Get a
perception.
job, you bum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I address this quote that you highlighted? 'Cause
Yeah,
it
go ahead.
brings up something I want
Do you
to
want
say.
to read it for us?
Already, yeah.
Yeah.
So this is Walmart. This is related to what you were saying, Nick. I think a little bit, but Walmart perfected the softer version of this model. So first of all, I strongly disagree with that. I'll get back to it. Sorry, I should just read the quote. In the 20th century, move into town, undercut the local merchants by selling items below cost, and put everyone else out of business. Then, as sole retailer and sole employer, set the prices and wages you want. So, what if your workers have to go on welfare and food stamps? So, can I talk about this one?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, I think there's really important distinctions between monopolies and non-monopolies, and I think he's being a little bit careless with them. So, like, Walmart may be the only employer in a particular town. I can't really speak to that, but it's certainly not the only person you can buy your stuff from. It has major competitors in Amazon, for example, and Target and others. And so, like, that for the consumer, again, which he doesn't seem to emphasize, has generally, like, kept the prices at least fairly low, and like people being pretty happy with the selection and that kind of thing. When you have a monopoly, like those sort of preference-driven choices kind of break down. And he's talking about it in relationship to a company above that actually had the monopoly on making rope, like literally had a monopoly organized with the government, which I'm sure had very different implications for the market and for the consumer and for the quality of the product. And you know, so like that's not really a fair comparison to be making. Hey, let's go. So that upsets me because I think it is really important to pay attention to when we have a monopoly. Yeah. And so to be careless about that bothers me.
And I think what he isn't really concerned about here is that there's a monopoly in terms of there's only one place consumers can buy things, but I think he's more concerned about the fact that there's this monopsony on labor. So there's only one buyer of labor in the town.
Right.
So if people want to sell their labor, they have to sell to Walmart.
Right.
But when there's a monopsony on labor, the reason you're worried about that is because of people's incomes. So it's not just that there's a monopsony on labor; it's that there's a monopsony on income. There's, if there were a basic income, then perhaps you wouldn't be, seeing this
Well,
kind
then
of
they
a
wouldn't
problem.
have a monopoly on income. Right?
They wouldn't have an monopsony on income, right? That's exactly right. So he says, so what if your workers have to go on welfare and food stamps? So I kind of want to go around the room and ask you guys, is it? I mean, I've asked this question before, but since it's come up right here again in this article, is it bad for Walmart workers to have to go on welfare and food stamps? And if it's bad, whose fault is it? So I'll
You
start.
came at just the right
Bethany.
time. Oh, I was looking for a different quote, so go to someone else for a second.
All right,
and then
we'll start
I'll
with
jump in.
Nick. How do we feel about Walmart workers being on food stamps?
I guess I want to think about it a little bit more.
Yeah. Okay. That's okay.
I'll pass for now.
Yeah.
Well, I think that if we replace the food stamps in our minds with, like you said, like a basic income that everybody gets,
Yeah.
we wouldn't feel so bad about it. I think partly like the food stamps themselves have welfare implications. I don't mean welfare like this, but like social well-being implications in the sense that they're fairly stigmatized. You can't use them on anything. You have to use them on food. They probably require like different kinds of jumping through hoops to get. And so it's not just like people there get some additional money from the government. It's like something that's worse than if they were to get more wages from Walmart. Right? It's not equivalent to like a higher wage. Whereas if they were getting an UBI that supplemented their income, it would basically be equivalent for their well-being to getting the higher wage.
Okay.
And
So
I just wonder how we feel about that. I think we feel differently.
so you feel like this is kind of bad. Whose fault is it?
Well, I think it has those limitations, yeah.
Whose fault is it?
I wouldn't say it's bad because you didn't give me a comparison of like bad compared to what, not getting the food stamps and like just having the same everything else.
Okay.
Whose fault is it?
Whose fault is it that this is happening? Yeah.
Whose fault?
Whose fault?
I mean,
a lot of people would say it's Walmart's fault, not paying your workers enough, so they have to go on food stamps. Would you agree with that?
I think it's really hard to assign blame because like people may not even have the understanding in the decision-making positions, like in government, to be seeing an ideal solution here.
Okay.
So I'm not sure I feel like I want to point my finger at anybody in particular.
Okay. All right, Jim, do you have any thoughts on this? Walmart
Not
workers
very-
and food
Not
stamps.
very deeply considered, but
Yeah.
I'm thinking of the comparison between, and maybe he does this in the article, I don't know, but between Uber and Walmart. I mean, to me, Walmart is successful because they actually put together a business model that met people's needs, and people went to Walmart instead of the local store
Right.
because the prices were less, and so I'm kind of, and maybe this is something I'm bringing into this discussion that I carry with me about this, is that we live in an age, or we have been living in the age of the 20th century or whatever, of pretty significant changes in the economy, and I'm thinking, the Rust Belt and things that have happened, and you can think of Uber or even personal computers or whatever, these big changes that have changed the way we spend our time and what we choose to do. And to me, those are not the fault of the consumer. And I don't think they're necessarily the fault of the individual entrepreneurs or enterprises that are doing it. I think it is more of a reality of this culture that we've put together. And the failing, to me, is that in that process, you have a lot of people who suffer. And what can we imagine we might do that would ameliorate that suffering, or even go beyond that to imagine a situation or a system that would enable people to actually flourish on this situation. So they lose their job that they had the training to do, but and of no fault of their own. And so something happens, whether it's UBI or not. I don't know to what extent. It occurs to me that UBI might be part of a system which would now allow people who are affected that way to move on to something else that would be more hopefully even more rewarding than the last work that they were doing. Now, we know that people who are spent long years of their lives learning to be an expert at doing something and getting great satisfaction from doing that, shifting to something else doesn't happen easily.
Oh yeah.
But if we could figure out a way to facilitate its happening better or to ameliorate suffering associated with the change, I think that is something that a civilized society, a wealthy civilized society, should figure out how to do, aspire to do.
Yeah, that's a good answer. What do you think, Elizabeth?
Yes, I think it's a bad thing. If people are not able to provide for their own basic needs, like without having to like jump through a lot of bureaucratic hoops and all the inefficiencies and stuff that Bethany alluded to around the food stamps and other government services. I think it's partly Walmart's fault and partly capitalism's fault. I know the answer surprises no one who's ever seen this here before.
What, Elizabeth? Where's this idea coming
I feel like it's partly Walmart's fault that like they're choosing to be like, okay, like because we can get away with paying people this very low amount, like we can have these super low prices, but like you can't, if someone's like, so like steel costs this amount, like this is how much it's going to cost you to build your factory. If you're like, well, how about if I just pay you less, like that's often not a thing that you can get away with, but we can get away with doing it with labor. And so companies choose to do that. And I think that that's like a bad choice, like an unethical, not, I forget what the opposite of pro-social is, I guess antisocial. Like it's a bad choice that they're making, but it's also partly capitalism's fault because they're incentivized to be like, okay, how can we cut corners the most? Like if they could pay less for steel, like they would also pay less for that. And the way in which we've been like, okay, low prices are the best thing, and not looking at all the negative externalities of that, of like, oh, okay, are you having poor labor conditions? Are you getting materials in a way that is like really destructive to the environment? Yeah.
What do you think, Richard?
Well, I see the welfare and the food stamps as a subsidy for the business, like the wage subsidies that they were mentioned in the forum last week on Thursday. That they it's just a stopgap. The business, they're not going to build their business or whatever there if we don't give them the subsidy, and people are going to starve if we don't pay the subsidy to the people. So it's a subsidy to both the people and to the business itself. So if we had a basic income, then we could cut out the middleman, so to speak, and just have the people decide how they want to spend their money, how they want to structure their society, and how they want to I don't know what to say.
How they want their communities to look and their society to look and that kind of thing. So this is an interesting thing, and I think there are at least three different major things that we kind of expect from the labor market. One is that it provides people income so they can spend money, through labor. And then the second one is that the labor market incentivizes enough labor in the economy that we can produce the stuff that we want to produce in our economy. And then the third thing is that it provides people provides workers with a sense of dignity and purpose through their jobs. So I would say that Walmart, in trying to get labor as cheaply as possible, they're really participating in function number 2 of the labor market, or expectation number 2. And I don't think that's like an evil thing, or I might disagree with Elizabeth that this is wrong or immoral. But it does feel that way if you're expecting people to get incomes from the labor market as workers. And it feels that way if you're expecting people to be treated with dignity, or to derive dignity from their role as workers. If they're if they're just being treated as kind of interchangeable, and not being paid very much, and that kind of thing. But the question I would ask, and this is a question I asked at the forum, the Kennedy forum last week, where I was with Richard. To what extent do we want to sacrifice efficiency in the labor market? So efficient allocation of the resource of labor. To what extent do we want to sacrifice that to help improve some of these other things to the labor market, to help improve people's incomes, and help improve people's self-worth and purpose and meaning and dignity? And I would argue that in an ideal world, the labor market would be just about allocating labor. And if people got incomes from jobs, if whoever happened to have a job, got some income from that, that's more of a side effect of the labor market. That's not like the main thing that we expected it. And then if the economy as a whole, consumers aren't spending enough money, or they don't have enough incomes, then you look more towards something like a basic income to address that. And if people are feeling lost and purposeless and something like that, we can ask the question, how do you provide people meaning and purpose? And the answer for maybe some people is to make up work for them to do, or to manipulate the labor market to create jobs, or that kind of thing. The kinds of things we do now to kind of keep everyone employed. But I think for some people, kind of like the make work answer is not the right answer. And I think people have a lot of potential to be excited about exploring other different things. So I think our expectation that Walmart take care of its employees, that is, that's kind of feeding into this whole, we need to make sure that there's work for everyone to do and that it pays enough. And I think that limits what we can be as people.
I agree with you 100%. Yeah. And I in addition to agreeing with you 100%, I want to add one point about like the steel analogy that you brought up. So I think that something that I have a hard time like locating in that's also important is the bargaining power of the workers. So like nobody needs to sell you steel to live or anything, whatever. So there's like, they're going to sell you steel if it's profitable to sell you steel. But with human labor, as you're pointing out, like people are going to otherwise starve. There's like not a lot of bargaining power, and that's sort of how it becomes possible for right. Conditions to be bad without regulation, for example, even to take it out of wages. So
right.
So I think that's also addressed by basic income, but I just want to add it as like a second thing, which is the labor market is also operating in the context of how much bargaining power the laborers have. And
yes.
So like a basic income also gives them that bargaining power to like turn things down, which also affects the labor market, if that makes sense.
I think that's a really good point. And I agree with something Elizabeth said, which is that, people are really suffering. Right. There are people out there who have these crappy jobs, and then on top of that, they have to jump through various bureaucratic hoops, to get on these programs where they kind of end up being demeaned in the end anyway. This is a bad thing. And we have this expectation that kind of Walmart should be doing better so that people don't have to feel this way. But we can also ask the question, like, whose job is it to take care of people? Who represents the interests of the people? And I would say that that's the government. That it's the government's responsibility. So I would say that this is a problem, and it's the government's fault. And it's the government's fault because the government is representing what the people want, and people don't really understand how some of this stuff works, and they don't really understand how basic income can kind of fit into the economy. So really, it's our fault.
Can you? Your mom has said a lot of interesting things.
So first, you said major competitors online too for consumers, so not workers.
Yeah, like
so that's you're talking about like Amazon competing with Walmart and stuff like that. And I think Douglas Rushkoff, the author of this article, is using the word monopoly, but it's not really that there's only one place you can buy stuff. It's more that there's only one place in your
I'm
town
just
where you
irked
can get a job.
because he's careless about it, because he's talking about an
Yeah.
actual monopoly in the paragraph.
That's true.
I'm just being.
And welfare is stigmatized. Whose fault? Economic forces that Walmart are also subject to. And I think that's right. I mean, like, we can say that, Walmart is getting rich and, they could be paying their workers more. But part of the reason they've been so successful is because they've been able to be so efficient and, drive these other companies out of business that were perhaps using resources, including labor, less efficiently. So, it can be easy to see like all these dollars and say, well, we could just take some of those dollars and send them somewhere. But it doesn't exactly work like that, because as soon as you start changing, how the money is flowing, that can have drastic impacts on, the structure of the business and whether it's viable and that kind of thing. UBI as unemployment assistance that doesn't run out. There's no requirements to get it. So I think that's right. But I don't like framing UBI as unemployment assistance. I like framing it as something that's basic. So basic income is it's income that is basic. It's something that everyone gets,
A floor.
and it's a floor, and it's not something that you have to earn. Like the idea that I think there are some people who kind of frame basic income as like we've all earned the right to the earth's resources, blah blah blah. No, it's not really something you earned. It's we care about people and we have the resources to sell you stuff, so we're going to give you the money to buy it.
Right, like why do you have to earn the right to well-being? It's kind of something that maybe people we want them to have.
I think it's reasonable for our first principle to be that we care about people and we care about people's well-being. It doesn't have to be that they earn a living or they earn the right to have.
Otherwise, you don't earn it, you just suffer.
Right.
We don't care about you.
And,
what's the alternative?
Yeah, I mean, I think we lived in a world where we really needed everyone's contribution, and if you're not contributing, then we don't have the resources to provide for you anymore. Then you'll have to contribute, but that's not really the world we live in.
Right, but it's still the mindset. I feel like
it's still the mindset we have. Yeah. So then she said, but running a business has costs, so it's better to pay the workers less if that means keeping them working. I think I think when you ask a question like that, you're still thinking about the well-being of the worker. And obviously because of what I said before, my preference is to think about the well-being of people, not necessarily in the capacity of being workers.
And then basically she and I were having a discussion about whether people kind of existentially sense whether if they have like a job that's not really contributing that much, like whether people existentially sense that and are less happy versus like they don't really know or they can be in denial. So it was just sort of a side conversation.
Yeah. I think there are a lot of people who do sense that about their jobs.
I kind of feel like that's... Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but that's different from saying that people who are working in jobs that wouldn't exist in an efficient economy all feel that way about their jobs. Like there are jobs we could look at today that seem... Hello. Hi, Nick. This is Nick. He's here for the first time. So you have two Nicks.
Two Nicks, all right. Cool.
Yeah. So if you want to be on the internet, you can sit in these chairs if you want people to see you, or if you prefer people to only hear your voice, you can sit over there. So I don't know what I was saying, but we're talking about Silicon Valley, and this, I don't know if you read the article, but it's written by Douglas Rushkoff, the guy who wrote Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus. Mm-hmm. And he's using an analogy to Walmart. He's comparing Silicon Valley to Walmart. Uber is driving out the taxi companies in much the same way that Walmart drives out all the other local retailers in the town, that kind of thing. Yeah.
I wanted to go to another quote.
You want to go to another quote? Okay. What do you got?
If we're done with this one, are we kind of...
Sure.
Okay. Right in the paragraph above, from sensing the opportunity to the islands.
I typed a K instead of the whatever I was supposed to type.
Sensing. Second sentence. This is the second sentence, actually.
Sensing an opportunity to exactly this one.
No, just through the sentence, that's it.
This?
Yeah, so this is talking about a historical example where a company was really powerful and it basically got a government granted monopoly over a resource, or like over an industry, it sounds like.
Yeah. Do you want to read the quote?
Yeah, sensing an opportunity, the executive of what was then the most powerful corporation the world had ever seen, obtained a charter from the king to be the exclusive manufacturer of rope on the islands. So I picked this because, like, one of the things I was sympathetic to a little bit was the concern that, like, if you have too much power in a particular organization or too much inequality, you start to see the rules being changed to favor those that are powerful in a way that harms others.
Right.
And I don't necessarily know that I feel like I've seen a lot of that coming out of the current Silicon Valley. So that's the way in which I'm not, like, so much vibing with him on this. But it is, like, one of the concerns that I think basic income itself doesn't necessarily address. Which is because it doesn't address inequality like we talked about. So it doesn't address the concern that, you know, the government is going to stop representing the people well, or represent the people even less well, you know, depending on what you think it is, because of these kinds of feedback loops. So this was just something I wanted to highlight in the article as an interesting point. I don't know what people think about that, but did that point make sense to anybody? Like this sort of feedback, yeah. If you can have some power to change the rules in your favor, the sort of feedback loop that can happen there.
Right.
And having a monopoly is one example. So like an actual monopoly over an industry means that you don't have to necessarily set the lowest prices or have the most efficiency or have the best product because people don't have any alternative options.
So part of your concern is that the government is going to end up representing the money instead of representing the people.
Yeah, that it could. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
More than it already does.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
More than,
relative.
yeah.
I'm sure it's gonna get.
But I think like I'm not saying that would necessarily manifest as like companies getting monopolies, but that would be one way in which that could happen. That would be an example of that happening if like Amazon was like, we can be the only ones to sell products on the internet. There can't be a Walmart, there can't be a Target or whatever, and then you would have presumably a reduction in quality for the consumer and so on. So
I think they call that government capture.
Yeah. Exactly. Government capture. So I thought that was a point. Despite all my problems with the article, that was one point that I was like at least theoretically sympathetic to.
Okay.
And sorry, and is he arguing, or are you saying that UBI could make that worse?
I don't know that I take the stance that a UBI would make it worse. Because on the one hand, a UBI would.
He's saying it would, though.
He is saying that it would. I don't necessarily hold the same opinion that it would make it worse. I just don't think it solves the problem necessarily. It might even make it less bad. We've talked about how people might have more time to be more civically engaged. So it's not necessarily going to address wealth inequality, but it might address some other kinds of inequality, like ability to participate, kind of basic blocks to being able to vote or like be activist or. So it's not clear to me it would make it worse. It could make it better, but I don't see it like fully solving. Does that help clarify? Yeah. And maybe other people disagree and think it would make it worse.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that on the sort of government capture level, it potentially makes it better. But I think on other dimensions, it doesn't necessarily help. That like if Amazon has basically like either pushed everyone else out or has sort of like conglomerated them to be like, okay, like well you can just sell through our marketplace, then they have a sort of effective monopoly that they're like, okay, everyone's going through us. And so if consumers have like more money to spend, but other outlets don't exist anymore, then it's like, well, okay, if I think, maybe Amazon, isn't treating its workers terribly anymore because they have more bargaining power, but they're still doing other terrible things. Right. You're like, oh, I don't want to support them. I want to spend my money somewhere else. You're like, and the somewhere else doesn't really seem to exist in a functional way. Like, yeah, then you get sort of back to the like, okay, if there's only one person making rope, then like you're like, okay, cool, I can have $1 million, but if nobody else is actually making this, like short of my like buying my own farm, and making my own rope, like
exactly. Break up trust, like Teddy Roosevelt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I mean,
so like
you hear a lot about that. People say they, perhaps Facebook and YouTube, they've gotten so big they should become public assets at this point.
Yeah.
So.
I was going to add like a well-functioning government that's maybe still somewhat representing the people can like address monopolies and has in the past to some degree. But if there's too much capture of the government itself, then you might not see that happening, right? Like with you could see monopolies forming.
So out of curiosity, Nick, if you don't mind, I'd like to know what you think. Did you have a chance to read the article?
Briefly, yeah.
Okay. I would like to know what you think about Silicon Valley in general and how you feel. I know you're pro UBI because we met in a UBI chat.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you feel about Silicon Valley's involvement with UBI and the fact that there's a lot of promotion of the idea of basic income within Silicon Valley and that kind of thing?
Yeah, because all you usually see in the headlines is just like automation. They're going to take our jobs, and it kind of see that since they're on such a cutting edge of what's going to be automated. You know, nowadays a big thing in education is like teaches kids to code. It's like, well, that'll probably get automated too by the time they finish high school, or college. So I think they're seeing that part of it, but I think they're also seeing just kind of which I'm kind of more signing on, like, oh, well, everybody should have the right to the resources they need to survive, part of that. And I think that's why Chris Hughes, who was one of the main Facebook people, he just put out a UBI book, because he just saw how work is not paying off the way it is for most people. And I think the main thing he was saying, when I haven't read the book yet, but in interviews about the book, he's like, well, I made about 50 million in doing 3 years of work. So
I think it was
maybe
500.
well, something
Yeah.
ridiculous like
Yeah.
that for working 3 years. That's quite a salary, right? So I think they're kind of seeing, well, if this is going to be the case for a lot of us who are really getting big deals off of these new industries, that perhaps this is something that needs to be something that everyone has access to. Because I made a lot of money off of Facebook because so many people put so much into it. So it's kind of a public good, and that should kind of be a public asset in that regard. So I think that's kind of, they're seeing, of course, the automation future, but they're also seeing perhaps we should figure out a different way that we should earn. Because I know they mentioned Marina Corbis on this as well, and I saw her on the podcast with Jim Pugh and Owen Poindexter, and she was kind of mentioning, like, wage labor is a relatively new phenomenon if you look at the historical context of civilization. So perhaps that's not going to be a norm in the future anymore as well. So
Interesting perspective.
it's kind of just a way to kind of have just that floor is really going to be able to keep things from becoming chaotic.
Right.
Well, more chaotic than they already have. So,
Yeah.
I know that's a lot of different tangents.
That's helpful.
Yeah. It's interesting that you brought up Chris Hughes and his book. He actually, it doesn't seem that he supports universal basic income.
Really?
No,
Yeah.
it's more about getting everybody who makes a certain income the income floor.
Right.
It's a minimum. He likes a minimum income. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
He talks about like expanding the earned income tax credit. So you're already, through the tax law, you're already getting a measurement of how much income people are making, and then you're spreading out the earned income tax credit payments throughout the year, and maybe adding more to it. And it wouldn't have to be necessarily earned. He does want it to be. He also wants it to be only for people who are willing to work, is what he says. It's not just, it's an income floor, but only for people who, I think he still has this mindset of feeling like people should want to work, should want to contribute, that kind of thing. Which I don't agree with. I think of the labor market as a market, and if you want people to work, then you pay them enough to get them to work, and that's kind of the end of the story.
Or what are you helping me with? Like more democratic ways of developing things. People always talk about minimum wage. It should be 15, and it's like, oh, well, what about the guy who just put up all of the loans and all of his assets into buying a piece of place? Should he have to pay everybody that much? It's like, well, then you can get a piece of what I'm earning, like part of the company, but can't pay you a minimum wage. And I think that's like a different way that more low-wage workers are going to be able to negotiate.
Oh, that's interesting.
Their
That came up in
when
this
they have
article,
that income
actually.
floor that they're not showing up to work out of a desperation. And the only way
What
to
does he actually?
survive.
Oh,
Sorry, what does he actually mean by like having a stake in this? I read this article and I didn't and I was like, I'm very confused when he was like, oh, like
Right.
a UBI is terrible because then people still are just using money and I was like, okay, I mean, I'm with you, the capitalism's kind of terrible, but I'm confused.
Yeah.
He's like, instead you should have a stake. And I was like, but what does that mean? Like, do I get stock options? Like,
Right.
what is a stake?
I was
Like, do I
wondering about
get
that,
like
yeah.
a chair from the restaurant I can take home? Like, what? How is this actually benefiting?
Yeah.
Like co-ops and
Me, because like I would much rather have cash than like an equity stake, whatever.
Right.
But
One of the things he talks about is like a sovereign wealth fund type of thing, where, like with Alaska or like Norway, where they use like the mineral wealth or the oil wealth, and they put it into like a mutual fund type of arrangement, and then people get shares of it, and they receive a dividend from it every year or every quarter or something.
Yeah.
But he's also talking about like we talked about a few months ago, how you can get 10% of a company and put that into the sovereign wealth fund and get dividends off of that.
So yeah, it's really, really interesting because in the end, what benefits people is the regular income that they're getting from universal basic assets. I mean, so I can read this. Likewise, if Silicon Valley's UBI fans really wanted to repair the economic operating system, they should be looking not to universal basic income, but universal basic assets, first proposed by Institute for the Future's Marina Gorbis. As she points out, in Denmark, where people have public access to a great portion of the nation's resources, a person born into a poor family is just as likely to end up wealthy as peers born into a wealthier household.
Actually, universal basic assets are things like subsidized rent or universal health care or like broadband. It says at some point, while basic income is
just money.
Is money, yes.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that makes sense, and there's certainly things that the government should be providing for people, like healthcare and various pieces of infrastructure, and that's fine. But it's not an either or with universal basic income. And there are lots of basic pieces of infrastructure that people need. They need roads, bridges, healthcare, etc. But income is also one of those things. So I feel like if we're really defining universal basic assets as the things that it makes the most efficient sense for the government to be providing, then basic income should be one of them. It's not, universal basic income is one of the universal basic assets, or maybe it should be thought of that way. So I don't know why necessarily people are thinking of this kind of either or situation. It could be related to maybe how they're thinking about money, that they think, oh, there's a fixed amount of money, what's the best way to spend it? And you're like, well, there's X amount of money that could go toward universal health care, and if we put that money instead toward universal basic income, then we don't get the universal health care anymore. But I think, this gets into some of my monetary stuff, but I don't think that's how money works.
Actually, Charles Murray, libertarian economist, he wants to give people basic income and then have them use part of their basic income to pay for insurance, health insurance and things like that.
Yeah, he's like, I'm going to fix poverty and healthcare at the same time, which could possibly work because it's just kind of similar to what Donald Trump was trying to pass. Like, just open the market up and all the prices will go down. And he's like, well, everyone has $3,000 a year to put on healthcare. Everything's gonna open up to them because they know the money's out there. It's complicated.
I mean, that kind of plan, it depends on people not being idiots with their money, right? I think there are some things we know that people need, and it makes sense for the government to pay for those things directly. But then there's a limit to that, and people do need spending money, and some of them will spend it stupidly, but that's okay because they've got their healthcare taken care of, right? So I don't know that I agree with Charles Murray's plan.
There's also like a more specific argument for why healthcare should be provided by the government. Like, not just that people are bad with their money, but that because there are like these small probability high shocks, people are unlikely to save for those, and it even could be rational not to save for those, but like as a public good, you kind of want those covered when they do happen. Right. So like even a lot of economists would argue, even a lot of free market oriented economists would argue that health insurance is a good thing to provide by the government. So I think like the way I like to think about this is like what kinds of things just make sense for people to get to decide themselves like freely with their own money, what they want to spend it on, and what kinds of things are much more efficient to provide in a centralized way. And so like you said, like roads are public goods, like everyone has an incentive to free ride on everyone else and not really pay for the road. So like you should really probably provide the road from the central government. But individual choice of cell phone, there's no free riding problem. Like we should just be able to choose which cell phone we want with our own money, or choose to buy something besides a cell phone. That distinction makes sense. So that's how I like to think about like what the government should do.
Actually, libertarians want privatized roads, like in
Yeah, I know.
Illinois. there's a stretch of road, and you have to pay tolls to use the road, and that's how they want to fund the roads.
I mean, I guess there's a specific argument with tolls, but I could have made this same claim about other public goods. I think that one thing that frustrates me about libertarians, but I should hear out their argument better, is that I think that like there's a real incentive-based distinction between public goods where everyone has an incentive to free ride, like environmental effects are another one, and things where there isn't that kind of problem, like choosing which sandwich you want to buy where, so like public goods aren't solved as easily by the free market as like how to get a good sandwich efficiently at a low price. So
Yeah.
I disagree with libertarians on things like roads, fire departments, health insurance, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and Charles Murray might say, oh, hey, we gave these people this money to buy health insurance, and then they, didn't buy health insurance. That's on them. They're irresponsible people.
Right.
But really, it has to do with kind of the incentives like Bethany was
Right.
talking about. Yeah, go ahead.
And with insurance, not all insurance is created equal. There could be garbage plans that you could pay the $3,000, but you're not going to actually get much for the $3,000.
There's also some stuff that just is way more efficient to organize centrally, and a lot of stuff that isn't, I think, that much more it's efficient not to organize centrally. So like these are the kinds of questions that I personally want people to be thinking about, I guess.
Yeah. And basic income is never an answer for those things that we want to organize centrally.
Right.
It's how do you allow people to participate in the market for things that are efficient to be decided by the market.
Right.
That's all it is. It's
Right.
not saying, oh, we shouldn't have this other centralized
Right.
stuff.
It's not saying decide everything by the market or something like
Right.
that. Yeah.
Right.
I totally agree. Well, glad we all agree on that, or everyone else hasn't said anything.
Yeah. I don't know. Does anyone have any thoughts? We kind of went off on a tangent there.
to rant of sorts. Do we know what's going on in Denmark as another aside? Like why things are so kind of... Oh, I remember what I wanted to say about that, which kind of relates to that. I think in this article, he seems to be interested in the assets instead of basic income as a way to address inequality. But I'm not sure I was actually able to understand, like Elizabeth was saying, what he really meant enough to kind of connect the dots and figure out how it would do that. I don't know if anyone else who read the article had a better handle on that than I did.
Yeah, I mean, at some point he is talking about worker cooperative, so actually owning the business and yeah.
Is that kind of having
Yeah, that's the thing where I
blue
didn't click through. It
businesses?
was platform cooperatives, alternative currencies, favor banks, employee-owned businesses. I was like, I don't
Yeah.
have time to read all of these links.
So
Right.
so let me read this paragraph because I think it's a good one. Meanwhile, UBI also obviates the need for people to consider true alternatives to living lives as passive consumers. Sorry, I shouldn't be dramatizing it as much as I am. Solutions like platform cooperatives, alternative currencies, favor banks, or employee-owned businesses, which actually threaten the status quo under which extractive monopolies have thrived, will seem unnecessary. Why bother signing up for the revolution if our bellies are full, or just full enough? So I think the fact that he tacked just full enough on the end there means that he's imagining that the basic income will naturally be some minimum level of subsistence that we won't go above. Whereas as we talk about it in this group, we imagine that an ideal basic income is whatever level the economy can sustain. Right. Stopping at people's basic needs is not the goal here. It's unlocking the potential of the economy to produce stuff for people.
Right.
It really is solving the problem of how do you get incomes to consumers. So I think he's thinking about basic income. What he's criticizing is maybe somewhat different from how we think about basic
By
income.
his own logic, wouldn't Silicon Valley want to make it as high as possible because that money is theoretically going towards them, right?
I think he's imagining that it's being funded by taxes, so that there's these incentives by rich people not to want the basic income to be too high because then their tax burden increases.
Right, but they're making more money than they're being taxed. So well, anyway, it's not important.
The taxes just feel bad.
Right, yeah.
I think he's got
right,
this.
Right, they do, yeah.
I think he's got this exactly backwards because I think that what's missing, what's limiting this is not the incentive for people to make platform cooperatives. It's the time.
Right, right.
And the
and the
resources.
freedom.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah.
So if you had a bunch of people who could like quit the jobs that they hated because they had, now they could feed themselves,
If they had a basic income,
then
they could
those
chip
people,
in other
those are the people who are going to
$3,000
build
or
these
whatever.
platform
Cooperatives.
cooperatives.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's right.
Yeah, I was saying the same thing when we were just reading this. It's like, oh, but then like people could, pull their resources and have like a hippie commune where they're like, we
Right.
raise goats and do
Right.
circus performances, like
Right.
like we've always wanted. That like people are still
Right.
going to want to do
Right.
Yeah.
these things, and
We
then
need
people
a name for like that camp of the UBI
Yeah.
hopers for That's the camp I meant.
because there are people trying to do that under late stage capitalism already with like full or just full enough bellies. People are like, oh, but like the system isn't really working, or like I'm
Right.
trying to carve out my alternative,
Right.
circus existence.
Right. Right. And for what it's worth, I don't know how analogous, but like historically, it's usually not the poorest people who start social change, like, or they're often a part of it later, but like who think up the ideas or like end up being in charge of new things because of exactly these things. Like they don't have the resources, they don't have the time. So like, how can you actually, do that? I totally agree. What's a platform cooperative, by the way?
Let's find
This-
out.
This is I forget the name of the guy, but I think the idea is that how there's what's it called, like Mastodon. There are these sort of open source
Like collaborative comments.
alternative to Facebook.
Yeah.
The idea is
And
that
Mastodon's a Twitter clone.
somebody should make an app that's like Uber, except the drivers own it.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Like
And
my lawnmower. It's like about to sit in the garage all winter. So I'm obviously not going to be using it in the winter. But like, even during the summer, I'm only using it like once every 2 weeks. So why doesn't it just kind of?
Oh, like sharing it around or something
Yeah.
like that. That's interesting.
Yeah, if you have like one person on the block who owns a snowblower,
Mm.
and then like everyone
Right.
gets
Shares
to
it.
like, because it's like, okay, like once you've done your driveway, like you don't need the snowblower
Right.
again until it snows again, but like the
Right.
rest of your neighborhood could really use it. So why does each person have to spend like
money on a separate
yeah.
one. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, that's cool. I didn't know what that is.
I think that when he says platform, he means something like a internet-based infrastructure platform that
Right.
facilitates some business to act as a cooperative.
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
Or,
yeah, that make-
or the platform, and that the platform itself is cooperatively owned.
yeah. Okay, yeah. So like archive of our own, like where like we own the servers, that kind yeah. So yeah, people are already doing that.
Right. And people have been doing it for a while. It's not like
And it's usually not, and a lot of it's not Silicon Valley people. I mean, I think Mastodon might be, but yeah, a lot of it is just people who are like, I'm fed up with, my site being owned by like terrible people.
Yeah, and I think you guys are right that if people had a basic income, then they'd have more freedom to do stuff like this. The people who are doing it now are people who are so passionate about it that they're willing to scrape by with their resources, or maybe they already have the resources or something like that. But basic income, it opens up so much more freedom for everyone. So the idea that Silicon Valley is interested in perpetuating the status quo. I mean, sure, they are interested in perpetuating their own profits, and basic income is certainly compatible with that. People have more money to spend. But that's not necessarily what's bad about the status quo. I think a big part of what's bad about the status quo is that people don't have this freedom. Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
Like a month ago when Chris Hughes was at the forum,
Yeah.
he said that the other founders of Facebook, they had their parents provided them with money so they could drop out of school and build it out of their garage or whatever. Well, he didn't have that money, so he was forced to continue with his degree because he couldn't, he was the first one in his family to go to college or whatever.
Didn't get to become a billionaire.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even this guy in the article mentions that you do need some money and some freedom to start doing
That's-
risky things.
It's kind of the whole point of entrepreneurship. It's
Right.
gonna inevitably skyrocket because it's going to be a matter of a trial and error process, and usually going out for business for yourself is a sink or swim process.
Right.
So
Yeah.
kind of like Alexander Hamilton, somehow he got that. Thomas Edison. You ever heard that story? He's like, I tried to do this light bulb 90 times, and at the end he's like, oh, you tried 90 times and you didn't do it. It's like, no, I just learned 90 ways not to do it. He eventually was able to.
That's good.
Yeah.
Your mom said something. I also talked about the passive consumers, and I also wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
She said passive consumers equals he wants people to go work on a commune and grow their own food, I guess, which I think is funny. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, he's really kind of coming at this from the perspective of thinking of people as workers, that their identity kind of comes from how they contribute.
Right. But I also feel like there's an implication, I don't know if he intends this, but like, as with ignoring consumers in other parts, it's just like, do people not know their own, like know how to maximize their own happiness? It's sort of like a lack of agency, as if like consuming is something we're forced to do by Uber. We sort of talked about this earlier, as if we're kind of like forced to use Uber instead of taxi, as opposed to we're enjoying or getting some value out of using Uber instead of taxi, or buying from Walmart instead of, or buying anything at all, as if like that's something forced on us as opposed to something that we want to do. So I just find that like a little bit maybe extreme versus what I would say.
Doing the whole commune thing means you're not able to specialize in whatever. Say, if I'm not in a if I'm in a commune, I'm not able to specialize. So everyone has to produce their own soap and their own roof their own houses, and even though they're not particularly good at those things, but if they specialize, they're able to do. I'm just a roofer, and I can do everyone's house in the entire commune.
Yeah, like I don't think there's anything wrong with people who want to go live on any kind of like alternative living situation, but I just want it to be like a choice for people, and some people might want to just have their food produced by someone else and in an efficient way like it is now, and do art or like do something else or teach or so their choice is to consume movies or consume art supplies or consume clothes to go teach aren't necessarily like this passive thing that isn't fulfilling, and I just feel like he's kind of framing it in a weird way.
I mean, I know I want my food robot to be making my food for me so I can get on to focusing on other things.
Right. And some people like to cook, and that's fine.
Yeah, and that's fine too. So I kind of want to go to the next paragraph immediately following, just because it's more.
Oh wait, but I feel like we never addressed the question that I was raising originally that I think Elizabeth also had, which is like, how does his vision of like these public assets or this alternative to UBI, how does it like, maybe that wasn't the question in this paragraph, but like how does that relate to reducing inequality, which maybe isn't exactly what he's talking about here, but he just started talking about the revolution and stuff.
It's not exactly what he's talking about here. Here he's more talking about people having ownership of production and actively participating in production instead of just being, passive consumers, that kind of thing.
Or did anyone else think that?
And not being exploited. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
And not being like exploited labor. I mean, because this paragraph feels like a sort of like Marxist, anti-capitalist of like, like the workers should like own because they're the ones doing the productive work, and so they should have the ownership stake in that and be able to like reap all the benefits instead of being like, oh, I did some work, and like you, dude in a C-suite, get to like decide how much of the profits from that I actually get to get. Right.
Gotcha. So does he think that this will like supplant other companies and that's how it will reduce inequality, or does he not think it will reduce inequality? I guess it's that.
Well, I think, I don't know if he's getting into specifics here, but I think he's talking about, restructuring our society. Like, I don't know if he's imagining that these other types of organizations will outcompete what's already there, or if he's imagining that we'll put in some kind of regulation or restrictions or government oversight that will allow these types of organizations to emerge and become more competitive or something.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Sorry, you can go to the next one. I just wanted to.
Yeah. Anyone else have any thoughts before I read this? Okay. under the guise of compassion, UBI really just turns us from stakeholders or even citizens to mere consumers. Again, with the consumers.
Oh my God, we don't have poverty anymore. We're just consuming the things we want. Sorry.
Once the ability to create or exchange value is stripped from us, all we can do with
what?
every
Why?
consumptive act is deliver more power to people who can finally, without any exaggeration, be called our corporate overlords.
Okay. So first of all, I feel like he's envisioning like that drug from A Brave New World so much. Like the only thing you can buy, like consumption is not like, oh, I buy my goats for my farm or like my art supplies. It's like only I buy like television or something. Like I buy nothing else. It's like he doesn't really seem to imagine that people again are like doing things that they enjoy or want with their time and their money. Which seems like exactly what they would be doing. So it doesn't really make sense to me. And they can certainly create and exchange value like far more than if they didn't have the money to time.
Like how is that being stripped from us by giving us more freedom, more money to spend, and more time to decide, spend how we want and that kind of thing. The ability. I mean,
it's also not being given to us by Amazon or whatever, right? Like they're not giving us the basic income, the government is.
Yeah, I think he might argue that Amazon is pushing for a basic income, and they're ultimately the ones who would push it through the government and that kind of thing. So it's kind of connected in that way. But yeah, I mean, what was I going to say? I would say that existing jobs and requiring people to work, especially designing your economy in such a way that it creates jobs that it otherwise wouldn't need and that kind of thing. I think that takes away people's freedom, and that strips away the ability to create value, because you're making up work for people to do as an excuse to pay them. So you're paying them, you're giving them money, but you're taking away their freedom. And with basic income, you can give them the money without taking away their freedom. So I think he has this backwards. I mean, I think he has a lot of things backwards. As kind of Nick mentioned that too.
Does anybody disagree? We've said some strong things about this. Does anyone have a different opinion, or want to just add?
I mean, I think maybe he's making the case in a very extreme way, and I think he's getting a lot of things backwards. But I do worry about, like we were saying, that the problem of growing inequality, and I think the reason that's scary is because with these really extreme concentrations of capital is a lot of power, right? Mm-hmm. So they're going to capture the government, or they just have a lot of power because they control these big companies that are so present in our lives. And I think that I mean, he's sort of drawing a straight line, I think, from one to the other, and I don't think it's that simple. But I feel like there's something in what he's saying a concern that I share. I mean, it's not a real direct analogy, but I mean, an example of Uber. Like if you compare Uber to some locally, some platform co-op of drivers for some, this other Uber that's controlled by the drivers. That could, that might be a lot better. That might be a lot better for the drivers. I mean, I guess it doesn't really address which one's better for the riders.
Right. Well, unless you're forcing people to use it, then it will only survive if it's also pretty competitive for the users, right? But he doesn't really get into like what.
Right. I mean, I guess the way I imagine it is, you'd set something like that up, and you'd make it just as good for the riders,
right,
or like
right.
99% as good for the riders, and then you'd say, like, look, you should use this because it's better for the drivers,
right,
and they're your neighbors.
Yeah. Like it worked. Did you want to say?
Yeah, and sort of similarly, I think while a lot of this paragraph is really ridiculous, I do think that his sort of delivering more power to our corporate overlords, because he talks elsewhere in the article about how that money drifts up, and so I feel like part of the point that he's validly trying to make here is that if we just give people UBI and don't especially if it's just a minimum level and you don't change other things, that it ends up just being okay, then there's just more money funneling up, and then if you're not disrupting that overall capitalist system, and you're like, okay, so maybe people have like a slightly better floor, but ultimately we're the real power. Like, on the margin, each person is like that much better off, but you combine all that, and Amazon is like that much better off.
So you worried about some of the things Nick brought up about like what happened with that power and stuff like that.
Yeah, and so I feel like there are ways around that are not necessarily like, not that I'm opposed to like worker-owned whatever stuff, and I think especially in places like Cambridge, if you were like, we're like Uber, but only like 75% is good, but like it's worker-owned, people would be like, yeah, I feel really good about like ethical consumption, where I can be like, I'm throwing my dollars to somewhere ethical, that you could potentially capture a lot of market share in places like Portland, Seattle, Cambridge, to be like, we're an Uber alternative that's like social justice oriented.
Right.
But I feel like he makes a really bad argument here where I'm like, what are you even talking about?
Right, and I guess the biggest thing I take issue with is just that it doesn't seem like UBI is harmful for any of these kinds of goals, like we were saying before.
Yeah.
I mean, it
Right,
just
probably
doesn't
actually
solve
helps.
all the problems. I mean, it really depends on just what citizens decide to do with it. And, they're going to have just more power. They'll be more likely to vote, serve and do the other things that might not be as monetary based.
Yeah, that's interesting. So like that could be a way in which the UBI would have an impact, even though it's not direct, because people might be more likely to vote or vote differently or get engaged.
Yeah.
What he was saying, some parties, some factions of our government are actually worried about people being involved in government because it would force into being things that they do not like, like universal health care or whatever.
Right.
But what I was thinking, what I was going to say was that, like here in Massachusetts, there's a tax on like Uber and Lyft, and so the funds go to taxi drivers and subsidizes them.
Oh my god, that makes me so
And I
mad.
heard about that a few years ago, and they're like, "Here, you can use this to buy a vintage taxi cab, so people are more likely to buy taxis or something." I remember that's what they wanted to do. I don't really get that, but okay.
I guess for me, I get frustrated by that because it seems like a very inefficient answer to a real problem, like people not having spending money, like Alex says. But first of all, they're having to ride around in taxis all day that nobody wants to ride in, instead of just getting their time to do their other things that they want to do. So, again, I'd rather the money go to them just as a basic income, but I guess I'm just being redundant.
It's hard. A lot of these policies, they're not thinking, how does this compare to a basic income? We've decided
Right,
that
of
it's better
course.
than a basic income, so
Yeah,
we'll do this
I know,
instead. They're just
yeah.
not thinking about basic income.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. It's just, I understand.
So let's go down to the conclusion. Whether its proponents are cynical or simply naive, UBI is not the patch we need. A weekly handout doesn't promote economic equality, much less empowerment. The only meaningful change we can make to the economic operating system is to distribute ownership, control, and governance of the real world to the people who live in it. He's not wrong about some of this stuff. It doesn't necessarily promote economic equality, at least in terms of the numbers of,
Right.
how much more money the rich people have than the poor. I think it can help with empowerment, in the sense that people have the freedom to do more stuff and be more civically engaged.
And more money to spend on whatever, including political contributions or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think part of the problem here is that he's thinking of the ultimate problem being inequality and the lack of power of the workers, and he's criticizing basic income as a solution to that when that's really not the primary thing that basic income is supposed to do. So I can kind of sympathize with how he feels if he's thinking about the world from this problem of economic inequality and that kind of thing, and then he feels as if people are coming at him with basic income as the solution to that, and he's getting frustrated. Like that makes sense to me in terms of a narrative of but Silicon Valley, I think. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I guess I was just going to add that maybe some of this comes from the fact that in the public discourse, I feel like people sometimes lump together the problems of inequality and the problems of poverty when they can be separated. Like with something like a UBI, you could address one and not the other.
Right.
And so then you have to start thinking about how they come apart.
Yeah, I struggle with that a lot.
Yeah.
Poverty's gone. How much is inequality going to matter? I mean, how much are we going to be upset that Jeff Bezos is so rich if,
Right.
homeless people are off the street?
Right.
And,
Yeah, it's a good question. I think about it a lot too. And I think I like...
because we've never really seen a reality that was void of it.
Right, that's a really, really good point.
Even like the Soviets ended up having fat cats at the top,
Right. And I think some of the unhappiness about the inequality comes from the fact that we have a sense then that we should have the resources to address things like poverty, right? But if we didn't have poverty, how would we feel? It's interesting. I think the main concern that I have is the one that Nick raised, just about like secondary effects on things like politics or like a captured government, where it's possible if you don't have tight enough like campaign finance restrictions or like people find ways around it, that you have a little bit too much influence in a way that doesn't represent the public interest. Because I don't think that the really wealthy actually have diametrically opposed interests from everyone else on all things, but they can't also line up 100%. That would also be totally implausible, right? So like if there's a sort of influence on the government that's disproportionate, that's the main thing. Otherwise, I don't really care that Jeff Bezos is, really rich, I guess.
Yeah, if people are in good shape, it's not going to matter. It's kind of interesting how that may happen. I read a lot from a guy named Scott Santons, who writes a lot about, and he literally has his Patreon, pays him a basic income. And
cool.
he talks a lot about how just the way he maneuvers around life is a lot different, because he doesn't worry about money. He kind of just worries about other things. How much is that going to change for us? If we decide that we want to, just road trip for a couple of years before, we have kids, or, try a different career path, or
I agree.
how much would it pay for me to go back to college, or especially now that our careers aren't this whole go to school and you work the same job for 40 years and retire. It's not how it's going to go, and it'll be a lot easier for us to reinvent ourselves, which is going to be something that's going to happen to all of us in the course of our career.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And that reminds me of, I forget if it's in this thing that he talks about contributing. I guess it was a previous thing. But he says it, distribute, control. Anyway, I think in some ways you're right that flexibility and being able to be versatile helps us contribute more in this current kind of situation, whether it be in a job or outside of a job.
He does not use the word contribute anywhere in the article.
Oh, okay. Well, same idea. He said something about that, about not being able to contribute or not being able to do something.
Okay.
Just passive consumers, that whole thing.
Right. Yeah.
But I think it is interesting that the flexibility, again, that might actually help you figure out ways to contribute more, even if it's not a paid job. I guess you say this all the time.
Yeah, I think that's right. I kind of want to get back to the question of Silicon Valley. We kind of know what it looks like now with the startup culture and all of that, and technology iterating on itself, and a lot of these startups creating products for startups and that kind of stuff. What kind of things do we want to see change in Silicon Valley, going forward?
More people getting a hand in the market. A lot of Facebook friends, they were able to have something to sustain them while they worked on this, and that's kind of a thing with a lot of startup people. They just have something to hold them while they're working on that. And the cost to start up a startup, I think last time I checked, was about $5,000 and some change, which is what you can easily put together with three of your buddies, and you want to, and that'll open up that market of competition, and the innovation will happen a lot quicker.
Interesting.
And that's what I think, and that's kind of why it's specifically why Combinator's the one who's big with the economic security project and trying to get the pilot started in Oakland, because he's the person who funds startups, right? So he's like, why should I have to be doing this to get so many startups? Everybody should have this chance, and that way it won't just be in Silicon Valley. You know, there's a lot of cities that are coming up with bigger tech bubbles. I think heard even Fargo, North Dakota, they call it Silicon Prairie now. So like, how many Silicon prairies, Silicon mountains, Silicon small towns, and Silicon in the, you know, even in maybe some you know, disenfranchised urban parts, like that market will open up because everybody will have a chance to do something, and it won't be like, oh, if I fail, I'm down and out, and I'll end up having to, you know, get a bad job. It's like, well, I'm getting $1,000 that month. We're going to try again. So I think everybody having that access to that level of capital we have in this, you know, this 21st century economy is going to be something that's everybody's going to be able to make better use of.
Yeah. One thing I just thought of hearing you speak to is like, even a little bit of a baseline probably makes people a lot less of a credit risk for what it's worth. Like, so like even if you don't have the capital yourself, if you have like a decently steady income, then presumably you are less likely to suffer like a big shock that means that you like can't pay something back, or so I imagine like it would be a little more even.
What a mortgage broker is going to be able to do. It's like, you know, you're going to get the money. Just
right,
sign
right,
here, make
exactly.
sure you pay me $300 a month. You'll just fine. Yeah.
So investing in the kinds of assets like companies or mortgages or whatever that he seems concerned about might go up more than just the income you have, because you might be able to get loans more easily. Or more evenly across the population, at least with the basic.
Because they you know, landlords and people who make loans are risky. Like, you're going to be able to keep this job. I'll rent this apartment to you if you know this job's going to be different.
Exactly.
It's like, you don't worry about that. I'll sign this off because I know I'll be able to snatch $800 from you every month. You know?
Yeah, exactly.
And on the flip side of that, a lot of the people who are taking out loans because they're desperate or borrowing because, you know, or spending on credit cards and stuff like that, people aren't going to need to borrow as much.
Right, in that way, yeah. Exactly.
In that way, yeah. So not only is it going to be easier for people to get loans, but they're not going to need loans as much.
Right, so they won't be putting as much capital towards that kind of debt that is kind of like,
and that's going to, whenever we do our government, whatever, we saw what happened last night, it's a long time from now, but whenever our government is finally ready to get a bill passed, there's going to be a lot of credit card companies and mortgage brokers and people who really feed off us needing credit are really gonna push back against it really hard, because it's gonna inevitably put them out of business.
You think so?
Yeah. I mean, because they just, especially like payday cash loans and all of these people, you know, because they don't have access to those types of financial services, they're just not going to be able to feed off of them anymore. And
I agree that payday loans aren't going to be a big fan of basic income. Seems likely because the interest rate is so high.
Well, they'd be able to lower their interest rates, right?
Yeah, but then they'd just be like out competed by regular banks when they lose their interest.
I don't know. I guess it depends on who moves quicker, right? You might see kind of like coming together of traditional banks and payday lenders in terms of the services they provide and who their customers are and that kind of thing.
Right.
Either way, I think good things will happen.
Yeah.
And there's also an interesting question of, you know, there's a limit to how much consumer spending the economy can sustain before we start running into resource constraints and stuff like that, and then you have inflation. So something we might see happen if the basic income is high enough is you might see the Fed raise interest rates, and then that actually helps kind of like temper the amount of borrowing in the system as well. So it's not just that people won't need loans as much, but also the loans maybe on average might get more expensive. So they might be disincentivized as well to kind of keep consumer spending more steady. Yeah. And that can help with stuff like 2008. You know, like credit bubbles and stuff like that. When I talk to people about basic income, a lot of people are surprised some of the time when I say that, you know, well, basic income can help fix the business cycle and the credit cycle, and you won't have, you know, housing bubbles anymore and that kind of thing. And they're like, wait a minute, how does that work? But it's part of the reason we have those bubbles is because monetary policy is trying to get people to borrow in order to make sure there's enough spending in the economy. Basic income can solve that directly.
And who knows what type of way the Fed will operate in order to pay for it. Like, perhaps, citizen seniorage will be one of the, places where it comes from, perhaps.
Citizen seniorage?
Yeah.
Yeah, so...
It's like, why do the banks get to have all the fun with, the money that's created by thin air out of the Fed? Everybody else everyone get a piece of it.
Yeah, this is interesting because of, money is such an interesting thing. I always tell people to take the economics of money and banking course on Coursera. And the way he frames it is that everybody is a bank. And if I borrow money from Bethany, then I'm kind of creating money just in the way a bank does. And the banks are where they are because they've gained a lot of trust, and they've also filed the paperwork and jumped through all the regulations and stuff like that, which you and I can't really do. But the fact that they're able to operate on such a large scale just has to do with the fact that they've decided that that's what they want their business to be. Whereas I can't borrow money from some random guy on the street, whereas a bank could. Or I wouldn't lend money to a random guy on the street, but banks and have the infrastructure and everything to lend to anyone and check their credit and verify all kinds of stuff.
It's a fascinating class, this online class, and and it shows the way that these institutions actually do some really sophisticated things.
Yeah.
In terms of the fact that you can you give me an example? What's one of the interesting facts of life that they enable that you wouldn't have without a bank? There's a lot of good ones.
It enables you to essentially borrow money from someone who doesn't trust you.
Right. That's a good
So they lend money to the bank, and you borrow money from the bank, and they act as kind of intermediaries of trust. So it's important infrastructure. But I want to circle back to Silicon Valley.
You're on track today.
In terms of how it's related to this, which is that if we have a high enough basic income and it reduces the amount of lending and borrowing in the private financial sector, what's going to happen to the stock market?
So I was just worried about this, because I feel like there is some good stuff that comes out of the sort of innovation in Silicon Valley and other places like you were talking about, where most of it maybe doesn't go anywhere, but you have a good sort of evolutionary sort of dynamic happening where a few things succeed and they're really good because you have all this experimentation. And I worry that if there's less money kind of going into borrowing, if there's less money to be borrowing, there might be less of that innovation.
Well, it's interesting because you'll have more kind of money to just kind of bootstrap on your own and start your business with the basic income, and you're going to have more potential consumer spending to buy your product. So you'll really be competing for consumers, and maybe you'll start to see the way businesses fund themselves shift if there's more basic income and less, kind of equity funding and borrowing on Wall Street and that kind of thing. So you might see some of the incentives of these startup businesses to be more aligned with the interests of the people they're creating products for and stuff like that. And I think that would be a good thing. I think it would be a huge disruption, and it would break the whole model for how Y Combinator works and all of that. But you didn't hear that Y Combinator.
Actually, Kevin would be so happy he wouldn't have to read all those applications.
He's choosing to do that. He's that's not So yeah, I mean, imagining a world with a basic income, like Silicon Valley, a lot of these companies are imagining, we're making all these changes and eliminating the jobs, and people are going to need basic income in order to buy our stuff. And in that sense, it would maintain the status quo, but it really would be more about profiting from the consumer and less about kind of profiting from the financial sector and the stock market and investors with crazy pie-eyed ideas and stuff like that. Is that
pie-eyed.
Yeah. No. I mean, they'll still be around, but I mean, it's just an interesting thing to ponder.
Yeah, I know. It is interesting. This is the most subversive thing that you suggest about basic income that maybe people should be worried about.
Yeah, it's going to be scary to a lot of people. or it is.
But you also
scary.
don't know if
Yeah.
what's going to actually happen because like, a lot of people rely on the stock market. So I doubt it would crash all the time.
I mean, I think a lot of the things that people invest in order to kind of secure their futures are ultimately kind of detrimental to society and detrimental to the economy. Like buying a house as an investment, and then you have like speculative real estate markets and stuff like that. Like, really, the house. I mean, like, obviously, you know, there are people who are relying on that and depending on that, and you know, we don't want them to suffer. But the fact that we're not thinking of a house as a place where you live and you buy it to live in it, that's kind of problematic, and it distorts the market. You know, the value of your house shouldn't really go up over time, unless you're making some improvements or like some, you know, like.
Right. It actually should
Like-
go down because you're like using the house.
Yeah, I mean, but maybe you're putting in maintenance and
Oh, I see,
upkeeping it and stuff like that, so it would stay steady or something like that. But you know, a house as an investment is not, you know, like that doesn't make sense. Like you invest in businesses and things that actually produce stuff, and that makes a little more sense. And then you know, investing in the stock market, just like arbitrarily buying stocks and you know, putting money into an index fund and you know, having retirement accounts that you're not even thinking about. You know, just like assuming that the stock market is going to keep going up and up and up. I mean, like. I don't know if that's a healthy way for us to structure our economy and our expectations. And I think, you know, basic income could change some of that. And I don't think it's necessarily bad, you know, if everyone has a basic income. Is it the end of the world if the stock market crashes? Not really. I don't think so.
Any major
Yeah.
change that's fast is problematic. That's all. So you
Yeah.
want things to change.
Yeah, you'd want things to change gradually. One of the things that's hard is whenever something starts coming down, whenever you know, asset prices start going down, you know, you get into these feedback loops where it can't happen gradually. Like it has to be a crash. Like you've never seen, you know, the stock market not become more volatile when prices are going down and stuff like that. So I don't know if there's really a way to mitigate that, but we can mitigate the effects on ordinary people through something like a basic income.
Your mom wants
Yeah.
to know about investing in art.
How about investing in art or antiques? I think, you know, well, art is already like a really risky thing, and I don't think these are. I think you're gambling when you're doing that kind of thing.
It might depend on what she means by investing, like enjoying the art or wanting it around versus like just wanting it to go up in price. I guess I'm not
Yeah.
sure.
So you're talking about money and hoping to be able to sell it for more later, that kind of thing. Yeah. Richard.
Actually, there's Adam Ruins Everything had a thing about art, and
Oh, yeah,
the
he's funny.
people, the critics decide who gets the attention, and the attention is what fuels the prices to go up in art. And there can be artists that are much better than the ones that get the attention, but they remain obscure, like Picasso and things like that. They were ignored by the critics until after their death, but people buy the art galleries buy the things cheaply, and then they promote it, and then they can sell it at much higher prices and things like that.
Yeah.
So she's saying both.
Yeah, so I mean, I would say that I think the most solid kind of investment is the kind where you're like, oh, I'm going to create some real value in the economy and, you know, provide something that people are going to benefit from and then profit off that.
Could one argue that like index funds are basically a broad version of doing that?
One could argue that, and people do argue that. But I think once the market is just people expecting to make money and putting money in because, you know, like that's like the general behavior. They're not making the decisions based on what businesses they think are going to succeed. They're making the decisions based on trends in the market. That's no longer you're no longer actively kind of investing in something productive in the economy. And people might make arguments that these businesses are still doing something productive and therefore it still
I don't
kind
see
of
how on
qualifies.
average you are. If you're just tracking the whole market, you're saying the average business isn't adding value. Like, what do you say?
I'm saying that if you live in a world where everyone's going to buy all the stocks no matter what, it's no longer important for every business to add value anymore because all the stocks are going to get bought. So you take away some of the incentives for the business to actually be kind of adding value to the economy. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So I wouldn't mind seeing some of that change. I think index funds are the devil, by the
He
way.
legit tells me not to invest money in the stock market or in index funds.
It's fine. I mean, like, there's also
I'm
the,
just saying you truly believe what you're doing.
yeah, I mean, there's also the aspect of if everybody's doing it and then we all get screwed all at once, then you can maybe kind of expect some kind of intervention from the government, you know, that kind of thing. If everyone's retirement accounts all fail at the same time, then you would not expect the government to say, oh, well, you were all idiots for putting money in retirement accounts or something like that. They would probably come up with a plan like they did when Wall Street crashed. Yeah.
Retirement bailout.
Yeah. So let's go around the room and get some final thoughts about what you think about Silicon Valley and basic income. Just final thoughts anyone has. Go ahead, Bethany.
Well, I still feel generally positively about Silicon Valley.
Okay.
I'm now worried for them.
No, it's just they're used to disruption and change, and you know that's what they thrive on. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I think I'm good. Yeah.
I don't know. I found myself thinking about the kind of back on the subject of worrying about the concentration of power.
Yeah.
That it's. I guess this is a little bit like a singularity kind of thing. Like I do have a little bit of a worry. I feel like there's a chance that we are, you know, making some kind of transition where those companies that have this really, really vast reach in terms of the information flows are going to be just massively empowered. Like they're just like sitting on a very, very powerful gold mine, which is just the ability to look at the, you know, sort of, you know, see the economy or see people's behavior in a way that's never been possible before. And there's it's one of those like network effects. Like it's not possible unless you have this massive scale that they have, and that kind of worries me. I mean, that, in a way, that makes me more sympathetic to this view. It's like basic income wouldn't do anything about that,
right?
And so there.
Okay, Jim.
Well, I think that Silicon Valley is it's a good place for us to be thinking about UBI. There's power and wealth and all these things that are going on, and but a lot of positive things. So, you know, good place to try some things and stir the pot and see if something start to work.
Yeah. Cool. Nick.
Yeah, because I kind of understand the guys' caution, because it's like, I don't know, there's some very, very rich people who are advocating this, so like, that certainly could be a problem, but it's really just hard to tell at this point. We haven't a clue of what Silicon Valley is going to innovate and disrupt and change our way of lives in the next 20 years, and it's going to be so it's really hard to tell whether they're gonna gain more power and become more tyrannical toward us, or if it's gonna be something that kind of helps everybody compete with them. So yeah, you can't predict the future. It's kind of like you try not to use, when I try to advocate UBI, I usually don't try to do the automation argument because I just can't predict whether these self-driving cars are gonna take all the drivers out of business. So it's like one of those things. It's like, we'll see. But I do think that more people being able to try startups and try to innovate online is going to be something that's going to empower a lot of people, despite how much more powerful Silicon Valley will become.
Yeah. Elizabeth.
I don't like Silicon Valley. I'm really excited about the possibility of their like innovation matrix getting disrupted and them having to like actually produce like products that are actually good for people instead of what looks really sexy to wealthy investors.
Cool.
Do you think a UBI would relate to that?
Yeah, I mean, like, I think that's what like Alex was arguing a little while ago. That was like, oh, like that sounds like really exciting to be like, oh, maybe you have less power to like borrow from like
I see
big
that part,
investors and like big banks, and instead you actually have to like produce something that like individual people think is good, and you can't just be like, we have a lot of jargony terms and look, we're sexy Silicon Valley, like, don't you want to invest in us? We're gonna create the next big thing. We don't know what that is, but we have a lot of like words and ideas and maybe some robots.
Richard.
With what plaid shirt Nick was saying, well, there's data can become the new oil, and that people could be paid for their data. And but with the amount of access to data is what can fuel innovation. But with Silicon Valley only gets like 300 million people's worth of data or whatever, but China has 1.3 million people's worth of data, and they're innovating much faster because their government is actively investing in their companies to produce AI and whatnot. And so, like, their translation devices and things like that, they had 95% comprehension with English and Chinese, while the U.S. is just barely has 95 for Microsoft and whatever. So unless we invest in these things intelligently, we're going to fall behind. So we shouldn't pick winners. We should use UBI to have people invest in the things that use the services, pay for the services that they think are the best. Well, not with choosing winners with the government saying there was this big thing with back in the Obama administration about them putting $100 million or something in some Celeron or something like that a solar panel company, and that company going out of business.
Solyndra?
Yeah, Solyndra.
Yeah.
Like 6 months later, and so all that money disappeared.
All right. So I'm excited about the same thing that Elizabeth is excited about. I might frame it.
It's so good that we agree.
I know. Why do we agree on everything? I might frame it in a little bit of a different way. I would say that putting money in the hands of consumers is really going to help Silicon Valley, reach, heights that we've only dreamed of. I think it gives them the opportunity to innovate more, and the freedom that basic income provides will provide an infusion of more entrepreneurship and just more creativity and innovation across all of humanity. And I'm really excited about it. So that's it. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, and thanks, Mom.
She said something
She
similar.
says, I think that Silicon Valley, or they should be very, very much aligned, presumably Silicon Valley and UBI. UBI helps with innovation at every level and may help ameliorate the effects of joblessness due to technological change. And I would say that UBI allows us to eliminate all those jobs.
You want them gone.
I want them gone.
Possible.
Yeah.